Kakashi got much stronger in the War Arc. If you compare his MS and just base Sharingan versions to those same versions before the War Arc, the spike in power is amazing. And of course I'm not really talking about DMS Kakashi because that's another thing entirely, and I've made a video about him before. And we all know he's much more powerful, but he received Sage of Six Paths chakra, so that doesn't really count. But Kakashi, when he didn't have the DMS, when he was just, singular Sharingan Kakashi, he was still much more powerful during the War Arc, and it's not really explained why. We don't get a reason for it. So let's try to think, what did Kakashi do to get so much more powerful? But before we get to it, please subscribe to this channel and like this video to help me out with the YouTube algorithm. Thank you. During Shippuden, Kakashi really struggled with his Kamui and his overall chakra reserves. In his fight against Deidara, Kakashi used Kamui twice and had to stay in the hospital for a week after that, unable to move. And when he fought Pain, he used Chidori a couple of times, he used a Lightning Shadow clone, and then he used Kamui twice. Not only did he run out of chakra in that fight, but he also died of exhaustion because the Kamui and the Mangekyou drained his body so much. And then all of a sudden in the War Arc, he is spamming Chidori, fighting the 7 ninja swordsmen for a day. Then he fights Obito, who was at the time controlling 6 Jinchurikis, and those Jinchurikis were using either the version 2 cloak or their completed tail beast form, which, it's extremely powerful, no need to say that. Kakashi was fighting against 3 or 4 version 2 Jinchuriki at once at a point in the fight, and if you think about it, Orochimaru in the beginning of Shippuden was really struggling to fight against one. Some of those version 2 Jinchurikis Kakashi was fighting against had more tails than the version 2 Kyuubi Orochimaru was fighting against. Also, War Arc Obito by himself is already an extremely powerful shinobi, and Kakashi was doing just fine in that fight. Not to mention, Kakashi was spamming Raikiri, the lightning cable, and of course, Kamui. He uses Kamui in the War Arc as though he doesn't really have a limitation. He seems to have infinite chakra. Of course, he eventually runs out of chakra and falls to the ground in exhaustion, but it was just way more chakra than he ever had before. He then receives some of Naruto's Kyuubi chakra, which helps him out, but I would still argue that even with that little amp Naruto gives him, it's still a very impressive feat because it's only after Madara shows up in the battlefield that Kakashi actually gets some of the Kyuubi's chakra, and even still, he was still spamming Kamui like never before. Up until the point when Guy was fighting Jubidara, Kakashi was still using Kamui, and just then Kakashi said he was having trouble to see because of spamming Kamui and his Mangekyou and all that. Kakashi also fought Obito one-on-one in the Kamui dimension, and sure, that fight wasn't as impressive because Obito was actually trying to get Kakashi to pierce his heart with his Raikiri so he could get rid of Madara's seal, and Obito also couldn't phase through things because he couldn't use his Kamui because he was inside the Kamui dimension, so he had that limitation as well, but still it's a pretty good feat. Kakashi obviously gets much stronger in the War Arc, and I don't think anyone's disputing that. But why? Why does that happen? We don't see anything that indicates Kakashi would have that sort of power spike. Well, the first possibility and the most obvious one would be that he trained before the war happened. It's very much implied that Kakashi was a ninja that trained a lot, even though we are not shown. He improved a lot during the time skip, and it's very reasonable to think he would have trained before the War Arc. And that may be why he gets stronger and he can compete against characters like War Arc Obito and the Jinchuriki, but that doesn't solve the problem of, him having much more chakra and stamina than ever before in the war, because you can train to get a little better with those things, but the thing is, in the Naruto verse, once you mature as a shinobi, you can't really increase the amount of chakra you have, unless you pull something like becoming a Jinchuriki or getting Hashirama cells or something like that, and that's something Kakashi never did. But it's very clear appear that he gets much more chakra and stamina. He's able to sustain his Mangekyou powers for much longer, and I had a theory for that, which I am going to explain now, but bear in mind this is just theory, you know, it's complete headcanon, and it may not even be right, but let me get to it. So we know that Mangekyou users progress their Mangekyou the more they use their Mangekyou abilities, and that's seen with Sasuke in the 5 Kage Summit as he is evolving his Susanoo and his Mangekyou abilities. The more he uses them and the more his hatred fuels his body and all that. And that is obviously also true for Kakashi. The more he uses Kamui, the more adept he gets to it. The problem is Kakashi's Sharingan isn't his, and his body isn't an Uchiha body, so it's much more difficult for him to sustain the base Sharingan itself. Let me remind you that in part 1, Kakashi was bedridden for a couple of days after he fought Zabuza, and he only used his base Sharingan for that. But it is very much implied that Kakashi's body can actually get used to the Sharingan the more he uses it as well, because in the beginning of Shippuden and also in mid-Shippuden and all that, Kakashi is able to use his base Sharingan without much of a problem. So it is implied that Kakashi's body is getting used to the eye the more he uses it, and that makes sense. Though using Kamui is something else, because it's much more taxing to him, and he literally died doing that. But then in the War Arc, it seems like those limitations just went away. If Kakashi's body gets more used to the Sharingan the more he uses it, I believe that the same concept applies to the Mangekyou as well. So the more Kakashi uses the Mangekyou, the more his body gets used to it. Sure, his eyesight may get worse the more he uses it, but his body gets more used to it. And in my mind, literally dying because you used Kamui too much is something that would probably get your body some really good resistance as soon as it is brought back to life through the Rinne Tensei. It's kind of like when you break an arm or a leg so bad that when it's good again, that part of the limb that broke is so calcified that it will never break again. And that's what I think happened to Kakashi's body. It literally died because Kakashi used too much Kamui. So it gets this insane resistance after it's brought back, and that's one of the reasons Kakashi is able to spam Kamui without dying in the war. The problem is, Kakashi uses Kamui between his death against Pain and the War Arc. He uses it when he was fighting Sasuke and he Kamui'd that Susanoo arrow away, so he wasn't killed by it. And we can see that after one Kamui, Kakashi really struggles to maintain himself, standing up on water, which is something very basic for a ninja, and he was struggling with that, meaning that Kamui by itself really affected Kakashi's chakra levels. Now maybe Kakashi had to use that Kamui so quick because the arrow was so fast and that's why he spent too much chakra, but I don't really see much validity to that. He also had to do some very insane Kamuis before, like the one he used against Deidara when he exploded himself and he had to save his squad by sucking the explosion into the Kamui dimension. So that theory I had about Kakashi getting immunity because he died from it is probably not right, unfortunately. But I think it would be an elegant solution. Many of you may mention the mental amp Kakashi gains during the War Arc when he says, oh, when you're protecting your friends, you can do whatever you want. And I really think quote-unquote mental amps in Naruto are kind of bullshit, but anyway, you may claim that they may have helped Kakashi, but to that extent, I don't know, man. That seems a little off to me. Maybe my calcification of the body theory is actually true and Kakashi just had to catch up to it and then it happens in the War Arc. I don't know. Anyway, let me know what you think down below. How did Kakashi get so much more powerful? Because I ran out of ideas. Also, subscribe to this channel if you enjoyed this video and like it as well so you help me out with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for watching.